Janitor in Chicago stole $8 million from the Latin Kings and crossed the border on foot. The building housed dozens of businesses, law firms, investment companies, tech startups, but Carlos only cared about one particular office on the 14th floor, the one with frosted glass doors and no company name on the directory. He knew what everyone else pretended not to know. Suite 1407 belonged to the Latin Kings, one of Chicago's most powerful street organizations, and it served as their main counting house. 3 nights a week, men in expensive suits would arrive after midnight, carrying duffel bags and briefcases that clinked with the weight of cash. Carlos had watched this routine for years, his presence so ordinary that the gang members treated him like furniture. They spoke freely in Spanish around him, discussing territories, shipments, and most importantly, the money. Millions of dollars cycled through that office every month, cleaned and counted before being distributed throughout their network across the city. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. Now, let's get back to Carlos's story. On a frigid February night, Carlos's routine changed forever. His daughter Maria had called him that afternoon, her voice trembling with desperation. The cancer had returned, more aggressive than before, and the experimental treatment her doctors recommended wasn't covered by insurance. The cost, $800,000. Carlos had held the phone to his ear long after she hung up, staring at the dirty mop water in his bucket, thinking about the stacks of cash he'd seen just 12 hours earlier through the cracked door of Suite 1407. That night, Carlos arrived at work at his usual time, but his hands shook as he punched in his time card. He'd spent the afternoon researching, planning, calculating odds that seemed impossible. The Latin Kings didn't forgive theft. They didn't negotiate. They made examples of people who crossed them, and those examples usually ended up in dumpsters or floating in the Chicago River. But Maria was his only child, his reason for enduring 17 years of night shifts and aching knees. He thought of her at 6 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, before his wife passed. He thought of her at her college graduation, the first in their family to finish university. He thought of her now, 32 and terrified, trying to be brave for her own young son. The 14th floor was quiet when Carlos stepped off the elevator at 2 a.m. The counting usually happened between midnight and 1, which meant the office should be empty now. He'd watched the security cameras long enough to know their blind spots, the 12-second delay when guards switched between monitoring screens. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached Suite 1407, the master key ring heavy in his pocket. He'd had access to these keys for years. The building management trusted him completely. Good old Carlos, reliable Carlos, invisible Carlos. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed deafening in the silent hallway. Carlos slipped inside using his flashlight to navigate the darkness. The main room looked like any corporate office, with desks, computers, and file cabinets. But he knew better. The real business happened in the back room, the one with the reinforced door and the separate lock. His hands trembled as he worked, trying 3 different keys before finding the right one. The door swung open to reveal what looked like a small bank vault. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with brick after brick of cash, bound with rubber bands and organized by denomination. Carlos's breath caught. He'd seen glimpses before, but never like this. The money seemed to glow in his flashlight beam, more wealth than he'd ever imagined in one place. He thought of Maria again, her scared voice on the phone, and moved forward. He'd brought an old hiking backpack, the same one he'd used years ago when he'd dreamed of different adventures. Now it would carry a different kind of hope. Carlos worked quickly, stuffing bills into the bag with shaking hands. He tried not to think about what he was doing, tried not to count, but his mind kept calculating anyway. 50,000, 100,000, 200,000. The bag grew heavier. He should stop at 800,000, take only what he needed, but something made him continue. If he was already dead, and stealing from the Latin kings meant he was dead, he might as well be thorough. When the backpack could hold no more, Carlos zipped it closed and hefted it onto his shoulders. The weight made him stagger. He'd grabbed another bag from the supply closet, a large canvas tote, and filled that too. His rational mind screamed at him to stop, but his hands kept moving, mechanical and desperate. Finally, when both bags bulged with cash, he forced himself to leave the rest. The room still looked full. He'd barely made a dent in the Latin king's inventory, but Carlos knew it wouldn't matter. They counted everything. They would notice. Getting out of the building proved easier than he'd feared. The night security guard, Dennis, barely looked up from his phone as Carlos passed by with his bags. "Working late tonight, Carlos?" he asked, his attention already back on his screen. Carlos mumbled something about extra trash from a corporate event, and Dennis waved him through. Just like that, Carlos Mendez walked out of the Infinity Tower with approximately $8 million in stolen drug money. His car sat in the employee lot, a 15-year-old Honda with rust eating through the wheel wells. Carlos threw the bags in the trunk and sat in the driver's seat, his entire body shaking. He'd done it, actually done it. The reality hit him like a physical blow, and he had to grip the steering wheel to keep his hands steady. They would kill him for this. They would kill Maria, too, and her son, and anyone else he'd ever spoken to. The Latin kings didn't believe in mercy or partial revenge. They believed in sending messages. Carlos started the engine and pulled out of the lot, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. He couldn't go home. They'd look there first. He couldn't go to Maria. That would lead them straight to her. He needed to disappear completely, become a ghost, and he needed to do it before sunrise when the Latin kings discovered the theft. He had maybe 6 hours, maybe less. The counting crew would report to their bosses, who would immediately mobilize every soldier in the organization. Chicago had thousands of Latin Kings members, and every single one of them would be looking for a middle-aged janitor with 2 bags full of their money. As he drove through the dark streets, passing homeless people huddled against building walls and late-night commuters heading home from third-shift jobs, Carlos made his decision. He couldn't fly. Airports had cameras and records. He couldn't take a bus or train for the same reason. His face would be everywhere within hours, his photo distributed to every gang contact in the city, and the Latin kings had contacts everywhere. Police, judges, airport security, even some FBI agents. No, Carlos needed to do something unexpected, something that wouldn't leave a digital trail. He would walk to Mexico. The idea seemed insane, but the more Carlos thought about it, the more sense it made. It was 2,000 miles from Chicago to the Mexican border, give or take, and nobody walked that far anymore. They wouldn't expect it. They'd watch the airports, the bus stations, the border crossings for vehicles, but who would look for a man on foot? Carlos had $8 million. He could hide most of it, take what he needed for the journey, and retrieve the rest later, once he'd established himself somewhere safe. Mexico didn't have extradition agreements for gang-related crimes, and he still had family in Guadalajara who might help him disappear. By the time the sun rose over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Carlos had already driven 200 miles south. He stopped at a small town in rural Illinois, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, except for the occasional traveler passing through. He found a storage facility on the edge of town, one of those places with outdoor units and a gate that required a code, but no human oversight. Carlos paid cash for 6 months up front, using a fake name, and stored most of the money in the unit, keeping only $200,000 for his journey. The rest would wait for him, hidden behind a padlocked door, in a town whose name he'd already started to forget. He ditched the Honda in a grocery store parking lot 20 miles away, wiping down the interior and removing the license plates. Then Carlos started walking. He wore the same clothes he'd worn to work, jeans, a heavy jacket, work boots, and carried a smaller backpack with the money, some food, water, and a change of clothes. To anyone watching, he looked like a down-on-his-luck traveler, maybe homeless, maybe just moving from one town to another looking for work. Nobody gave him a second glance. The first day, Carlos walked 30 miles. His feet screamed in protest, blisters forming and popping and forming again. He'd been standing for 8 hours every night for 17 years, but standing and walking were different animals. By the time he stopped at a small motel outside Springfield, he could barely remove his boots. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, took his cash without asking questions and handed him a key to room 108. Carlos collapsed onto the bed without even removing his jacket, his body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline and fear. He woke 6 hours later to his burner phone buzzing. He'd bought it at a gas station that morning, paying cash, no contract, no records. Only one person had the number, his nephew Roberto, who worked as a dispatcher for a trucking company and had access to police scanners. Carlos answered on the third ring. "Tio." Roberto's voice was tight with fear. "They're looking for you. It's all over the news. The Kings put out a $100,000 bounty. They're saying you stole from them, that you're armed and dangerous. Every cop in Chicago has your picture." Carlos closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like concrete. "Is Maria safe?" "They went to her apartment. She told them she hasn't spoken to you in months." "I don't know if they believed her, but they left without hurting anyone. Tio, what did you do?" "What I had to do. Tell Maria I love her. Tell her to check her bank account in 3 days." Carlos had set up an automatic transfer before he left, $800,000 wired from an offshore account he'd opened online using false information. It wouldn't be traceable to him, and it would save his daughter's life. "And Roberto, forget this number. Forget we talked. If anyone asks, you don't know anything." He hung up before his nephew could respond and removed the phone's SIM card, breaking it in half and flushing it down the toilet. The phone itself he dismantled and threw in separate dumpsters as he left town before dawn. The next 3 weeks blurred together into an endless rhythm of walking, hiding, and moving. Carlos traveled mostly at night, using back roads and rail trails, avoiding highways and towns with more than a few thousand people. He bought supplies at small gas stations, paying cash, never staying in one place long enough to be memorable. His feet toughened, his body adapted, and his mind settled into a strange calm. He was either going to make it or he wasn't. Worrying wouldn't change the outcome. He followed the Mississippi River south through Missouri, watching barges push cargo upstream while he walked the opposite direction. In Tennessee, he cut west toward Memphis, then south again through Arkansas. The weather warmed as he traveled, February giving way to March, winter releasing its grip on the landscape. Carlos saw America in a way he never had before. Not from a car window or a tourist brochure, but up close, step by step, mile by mile. He saw poverty and kindness, decay and beauty, people struggling and people helping. A farmer in Arkansas gave him a ride for 50 miles without asking questions. A church in Mississippi offered him a meal and a place to sleep. A truck driver in Louisiana shared his coffee and told stories about his own daughter, who'd beaten cancer 5 years ago. "Don't give up," the driver said as Carlos climbed out of his cab. "Whatever you're running from, whatever you're running toward, don't give up." Carlos thought about those words as he crossed into Texas 6 weeks after leaving Chicago. He'd lost 20 pounds. His face had darkened from constant sun exposure, and his hair had grown long and shaggy. He looked nothing like the clean-cut janitor in the photo the police were circulating. He looked like a ghost, a man who'd already died and was just walking to his funeral. The Texas landscape stretched endless and flat, the sky so big it seemed to swallow everything beneath it. Carlos walked through small towns with names he couldn't pronounce, past ranches that sprawled for miles, through desert terrain that made his throat ache with thirst. He was close now, maybe 200 miles from the border, maybe less. He could feel Mexico pulling him forward like a magnet, promising safety, anonymity, a chance to start over. But the Latin kings could feel him too. They'd never stopped looking. In San Antonio, Carlos saw his face on a telephone pole, a wanted poster offering $50,000 for information leading to his capture. The amount had dropped from the initial 100,000, which meant they were getting desperate. Or it meant they'd moved on to other priorities, other enemies, other problems. Gang memory was long, but gang attention was finite. There was always another war, another territory dispute, another betrayal that demanded immediate response. Carlos kept walking, through Uvalde, through Del Rio, following the Rio Grande as it carved its way between two countries. The river looked smaller than he'd imagined, less like a boundary and more like a suggestion. On a clear morning in late March, exactly 53 days after stealing $8 million from one of America's most dangerous gangs, Carlos Mendez waded across the Rio Grande into Mexico. The water came up to his chest, cold and swift, trying to pull him downstream. Carlos held his backpack above his head, protecting the money and his few possessions, and pushed forward. His feet found purchase on the rocky bottom, and then he was climbing the opposite bank, pulling himself up with muddy hands, collapsing onto Mexican soil. He lay there for a long time, staring at the sky, feeling the sun on his face. He'd made it. Against every odd, against all logic and probability, he'd escaped. Carlos thought about Maria, who'd sent him a single text from a borrowed phone 3 weeks ago. Treatment working. Thank you. Be safe. One day, he thought about the Latin kings, who were probably still searching for him in Chicago, never imagining that their janitor had simply walked away. He thought about the $6 million waiting in a storage unit in Illinois, a fortune he might never be able to claim, but also might not need. In Acuña, the first Mexican town across the border, Carlos bought new clothes, got a haircut, and ate his first real meal in weeks. He called Roberto one last time from a payphone, using a calling card purchased with pesos. "I'm safe," he said when his nephew answered. "Tell Maria I'm safe." "Tio, the police stopped looking. The kings stopped looking. Everyone thinks you're dead." Carlos smiled at that, his reflection ghostly in the payphone's scratched metal surface. "Good," he said. "Let them keep thinking that." He hung up and walked into the crowded streets of Acuña, just another face in the crowd, another immigrant with a story no one would ask about. Carlos Mendez, the invisible janitor, had stolen $8 million and crossed a continent on foot. He'd gambled everything and won. Now he just had to figure out how to live with it. 3 months later, Carlos stood in his small apartment in Guadalajara, watching the evening news on a television he'd bought at a second-hand store. The anchor was talking about a major Latin king's bust in Chicago, dozens arrested, millions seized in what police were calling their biggest operation against the organization in years. There was no mention of a missing janitor, no mention of stolen money. The gang had apparently absorbed the loss, written it off, moved on, or maybe they'd blamed someone else, made an example of the wrong person. Carlos would never know, and he'd learned not to wonder. His phone rang, the new one he'd bought in Mexico City, properly registered and legal. Maria's voice came through clear and strong. "Dad, the doctors say I'm in remission. Complete remission. The treatment worked." Carlos sat down on his worn sofa, feeling tears stream down his face for the first time since he'd left Chicago. "That's wonderful, mija. That's wonderful. When can I come visit you? I want you to meet your grandson properly. He keeps asking about his abuelo." "Soon," Carlos said, looking around his small apartment with its mismatched furniture and peeling paint. He'd been sending Maria money every month, carefully laundered through legitimate channels, small amounts that wouldn't raise red flags. He lived modestly, working part-time at a local school as a, what else, janitor. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Come visit soon. I have so many stories to tell." After they hung up, Carlos walked to his bedroom and opened the closet. Behind his few shirts and pants, he'd hidden a backpack containing $150,000, his emergency fund, his insurance policy. The rest he'd slowly been investing in legitimate businesses under various names, building a future that didn't depend on stolen money or desperate gambles. He thought about that night in the Infinity Tower, his hands shaking as he filled bags with cash that didn't belong to him. He thought about every step of those 2,000 miles, every blister and aching muscle, every moment of fear when he thought he heard sirens or saw a police car. He thought about the farmer who'd given him a ride, the church that had fed him, the truck driver who'd shared his coffee and his hope. Carlos had crossed a line that night, one he could never uncross. He'd become a thief, a criminal, a man who'd stolen from people who killed for less. But he'd also saved his daughter's life. He'd walked across a continent on determination and desperation. He'd disappeared so completely that even people looking for him had given up. He'd done the impossible because the alternative was unthinkable. As the sun set over Guadalajara, painting the city in shades of orange and gold, Carlos made himself a simple dinner and sat by his window to eat. He watched people walking below, coming home from work, meeting friends, living their ordinary lives. He was one of them now, ordinary and invisible again, exactly how he liked it. The janitor who'd stolen $8 million and crossed the border on foot had finally found peace in the very invisibility that had once defined his entire existence. Sometimes, late at night, Carlos wondered if the Latin kings ever thought about him. Did they tell stories about the janitor who'd robbed them? Did they use it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that enemies could come from anywhere, even from the shadows where they'd never thought to look? Or had they simply forgotten him, one small loss in an empire built on countless losses and gains? Carlos decided he didn't care. He'd made his choice, paid his price in every step of that endless walk, and earned his freedom in sweat and fear and determination. Maria was alive. His grandson would grow up with his mother. And Carlos Mendez, the invisible janitor, had proven that sometimes the biggest risks came from the smallest people, and sometimes those risks paid off. He finished his dinner, washed his plate, and prepared for another night of ordinary life in his extraordinary exile. Somewhere in Illinois, $6 million waited in a storage unit, growing dusty and forgotten. Someday, maybe, he'd figure out how to retrieve it. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe some fortunes were meant to be left behind, insurance policies that guaranteed safety through their very abandonment. As Carlos lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of Guadalajara settling into sleep, he thought one final time about that cold February night in Chicago. He'd been invisible then, and he was invisible now. The only difference was that now Carlos Mendez had chosen his invisibility. He'd paid $8 million for it, walked 2,000 miles for it, and he'd do it all again without hesitation. Because in the end, some prices were worth paying, some distances were worth walking, and some risks were worth taking. Maria was alive. That was all that mattered. That was everything that mattered. And if the cost was becoming a ghost, a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in gang circles about the janitor who'd stolen from the Latin kings and simply walked away, well, Carlos could live with that. He closed his eyes and slept peacefully for the first time in months, his backpack tucked safely in the closet, his daughter's voice still echoing in his ears, his impossible journey finally complete. 2 years after Carlos Mendez had vanished into the streets of Guadalajara, the ghost of his crime still lingered in Chicago. Detective Marcus Weber sat in his office at the Harrison Street precinct, staring at the unsolved case file that had become his personal obsession. The janitor who'd stolen $8 million from the Latin Kings and disappeared without a trace. No credit card transactions, no border crossings, no sightings, nothing. It was as if Carlos Mendez had simply ceased to exist. Weber had been assigned to the gang crimes unit for 12 years, and he'd seen plenty of people try to run from the Latin Kings. They usually turned up in pieces within a week. But Carlos was different. The gang had searched for months before finally giving up, absorbing the loss and blaming it on incompetence of their mid-level managers. 3 men had died in the aftermath, executed for the supposed security breach that allowed a janitor to walk away with a fortune. Weber knew they'd died for nothing. Carlos had simply been smarter than anyone expected. The detective pulled out his phone and dialed his contact in Immigration and Customs Enforcement. "Sarah, yeah, it's Marcus. I need you to run that search again. Carlos Mendez, 54 years old, last seen in Chicago, February of 23. I know we've done this before, but humor me." While he waited, Weber studied the photographs from the crime scene at the Infinity Tower. The counting room had been professionally cleaned before they'd gotten there, but the Latin King's lawyers had eventually provided access through a complicated arrangement that protected everyone involved. The gang wanted the money back more than they wanted silence. The city wanted to appear like they were taking gang crime seriously. It was all theater, but it gave Weber something to work with. "Nothing, Marcus," Sarah's voice came through the speaker. "No border crossings, no flight manifests, no nothing. This guy is either dead in a ditch somewhere, or he's living completely off the grid." "Off the grid," Weber muttered, "with $8 million. After hanging up, the detective pulled up Google Earth on his computer and traced the route from Chicago to the Mexican border, 2,000 miles, give or take. What if Carlos hadn't used conventional transportation? What if he'd done something so simple, so old-fashioned, that it never appeared in any database? Weber had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about migrant workers who'd walked from Mexico to Chicago in the 1960s, following crops and opportunities. The human body was capable of traveling vast distances on foot. It just required determination and time. Meanwhile, in Guadalajara, Carlos was navigating his new life with careful precision. He'd developed a routine that kept him invisible while allowing him to monitor the situation back home through internet searches and occasional calls to Roberto from payphones scattered across the city. The Guadalajara he'd settled into was a sprawling metropolis of over 5 million people in the metropolitan area, a place where a man could disappear among the crowds if he was careful. His apartment was in the Analco neighborhood, one of the older parts of the city where colonial architecture mixed with modern developments. Carlos had chosen it specifically because it was middle-class and unremarkable, the kind of area where neighbors minded their own business and questions weren't asked. He paid his rent in cash every month to a landlord who barely remembered his name, but the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. One afternoon in May, Carlos noticed a man watching him from across the street as he left his apartment building. The man was American, Carlos could tell from his posture and clothing, and he had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Carlos's heart hammered in his chest as he walked to the small grocery store 2 blocks away, taking a deliberately casual route while checking reflections in windows and car mirrors. The man followed, maintaining a professional distance. Carlos ducked into the store and immediately exited through the back delivery entrance, something he'd scouted months ago as part of his escape planning. He moved quickly through narrow alleys, his knowledge of the neighborhood allowing him to navigate the maze of backstreets with confidence. After 20 minutes of evasive maneuvers, he felt reasonably certain he'd lost his tail. But the encounter had shaken him badly. After 2 years of safety, someone was looking for him again. That evening, Carlos sat in his apartment with all the lights off, watching the street below. The American didn't reappear, but Carlos knew he'd been found. Not by the Latin kings, they would have acted immediately, violently, but by someone else. Police, maybe, or a private investigator. The question was whether they had enough evidence to move against him, or if they were still gathering information. His phone rang, the new one he'd bought just last month, with a number that only 3 people knew. Carlos let it ring twice before answering. "Yes? Dad, someone came to see me today." Maria's voice was tight with fear. "A detective from Chicago. He was asking about you, about whether I'd heard from you. I told him the truth, that I haven't seen you in 2 years. But he didn't believe me." Carlos closed his eyes, thinking fast. "Did he mention anything specific? Any charges?" "He said they want to help you, that you might be in danger from the people you stole from. He made it sound like they were offering protection." Maria paused. "Dad, what do I do?" "Nothing. You tell him exactly what you told him today. You haven't seen me, you don't know where I am, and you're worried about me. All of that is true, in a way." Carlos rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "How are you feeling? The treatments?" "I'm good, Dad. Really good. The doctors say I'm cancer-free, but I'm worried about you." "Don't be. I'm safe. I'll always be safe as long as I'm careful." He said goodbye and hung up, then immediately removed the SIM card and destroyed it. The phone itself went into a plastic bag, destined for a dumpster 3 neighborhoods away. Detective Weber had indeed visited Maria, flying to her city at his own expense because the department had closed the case months ago. But Weber couldn't let it go. The perfection of Carlos's disappearance fascinated him, and the fact that Maria had received $800,000 from an untraceable offshore account 6 weeks after her father vanished told him everything he needed to know. Carlos was alive, Carlos was free, and Carlos had successfully committed one of the most audacious thefts in Chicago gang history. What Weber hadn't told Maria was that he didn't actually want to arrest her father. He wanted to understand how he'd done it. The detective had spent weeks reconstructing Carlos's possible escape routes, and the more he studied it, the more he became convinced that Carlos had walked. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No digital footprint, no paper trail, just 2 feet and determination. Weber had even started walking himself, taking long hikes on weekends, trying to understand the mindset of a man who'd cross a continent on foot. Back in Guadalajara, Carlos made a decision. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, not after being spotted. He packed his essential belongings, including the backpack with his emergency money, and checked into a small hotel in the Zapopan area, a newer part of the metropolitan area to the northwest. He paid for a week in advance and spent the next 3 days watching the news, monitoring police activity, and planning his next move. On the 4th day, Carlos spotted the American again, this time near the hotel. But something was different about the encounter. The man made eye contact with Carlos across the hotel lobby and simply nodded, then turned and walked away. There was no attempt to follow, no backup team, no aggressive approach. It was almost like a greeting, an acknowledgement. Carlos stood frozen, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. That night, Carlos found a note slipped under his hotel room door. It was written in English on plain paper. "I know what you did and how you did it. I'm not here to bring you back. I just wanted to see if you were real. You've earned your freedom. M.W." Carlos read the note 3 times before burning it in the bathroom sink. M.W., Marcus Weber probably, the detective who'd visited Maria. A cop who'd tracked him across 2,000 miles and 2 years, only to walk away. Carlos didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. In his experience, people didn't just walk away, especially not cops with unsolved cases. But as the days passed and nothing happened, Carlos began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the detective had meant what he'd written. Weber had solved his mystery, figured out that Carlos had walked to Mexico, pieced together the whole impossible journey. And that had been enough. Some men needed justice, but others just needed answers. Weber apparently fell into the latter category. Carlos eventually moved again, this time to a small house in Tlaquepaque, one of the municipalities that made up the greater Guadalajara metropolitan area. He returned to work at the school, resumed his quiet routine, and started breathing easier. Maria came to visit that summer with her son, staying for 2 weeks in a rental apartment Carlos secured for them. They explored the city together, the Guadalajara Cathedral, the Hospicio Cabañas, the massive San Juan de Dios market, and Carlos watched his grandson discover a world he'd never known existed. "Are you happy here, Dad?" Maria asked one evening as they sat in Parque Agua Azul, watching children play near the fountains. Carlos considered the question carefully. Happy wasn't exactly the right word. Safe, yes. Free, absolutely. But happiness was complicated when it was built on theft and escape, on choices that had required abandoning everything he'd known. "I'm at peace," he finally said. "That's more than I expected to have." "The detective who came to see me called again," Maria said quietly. "He said he wanted me to know that the case is officially closed, unsolved, probably forever. He said to tell you that you'd made history, whatever that means." Carlos smiled at that. Made history. The janitor who'd stolen $8 million from the Latin kings and walked to Mexico. It would probably become an urban legend eventually, a story whispered in gang circles and police academies, the details growing more fantastic with each retelling. And because no one knew the truth, because Carlos had vanished so completely, the legend would never be confirmed or denied. He would remain a ghost forever. As the sun set over Guadalajara, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold that the city was famous for, Carlos thought about Detective Weber somewhere back in Chicago, closing a file and moving on to other cases. He thought about the Latin kings, who'd probably forgotten all about a janitor named Carlos Mendez. He thought about the $6 million still sitting in a storage unit in Illinois, money he might never be able to retrieve safely, and decided it didn't matter. He had enough. He had Maria alive and healthy. He had his grandson laughing in a park. He had the rest of his life to live on his own terms. "Tell him thank you," Carlos said to Maria. "If he calls again, tell him a man said thank you." Maria nodded, not fully understanding but trusting her father like she always had. That night, Carlos slept better than he had in 2 years. The weight of pursuit finally lifted from his shoulders. He'd committed a crime, yes, but he'd also saved his daughter's life and proven that sometimes the smallest person in the room was actually the most dangerous. He'd walked 2,000 miles to freedom, and now finally he could stop looking over his shoulder and start looking forward. The janitor who'd stolen $8 million had disappeared into legend, but the man who'd saved his daughter's life had found something more valuable than any amount of money. He'd found peace. And in a city of 5 million people, in a country that valued family above all else, Carlos Mendez had finally come home.